In 1865, a small group of Republican congressmen and senators had high hopes for a vigorous Reconstruction plan. These men, and a substantially more diverse body of black and white male and female reformers who urged them on, foresaw not just the expansion of free labor, but a redistribution of Southern wealth and an egalitarian political order that included black male suffrage. Between 1865 and 1866, this group, known as the Radical Republicans, went from the margins to the center of the political debate, and they did so largely because Northerners perceived President Andrew Johnson as currying favor with an unrepentant South. The fight that erupted between Johnson and his own party in Congress opened strange new rifts in American politics and propelled Republicans toward a surprising and dramatic shift in Reconstruction. In a series of clashes with Johnson, congressional Republicans adopted increasingly radical measures meant to secure the fruits of Union victory in the war and protect the rights of the freed people. As the uncertainty of spring gave way to summer, Southern whites confidently assumed they would be allowed to continue with self-reconstruction. Under this theory, white Southerners reaffirmed their loyalty to the United States through existing political systems. With Congress out of session, Andrew Johnson, the Tennessee Unionist who had become president after Lincoln's assassination, set the terms. Despite radicals' hopes that Johnson would impose strict conditions on the re-entry of Southern states, he set the bar low. Southerners needed to repudiate secession and state debts incurred during the war, and confirm emancipation by ratifying the 13th Amendment, which outlawed slavery in the United States. Johnson also extended amnesty to most of the high-ranking military and civilian officials of the Confederacy. Over the summer of 1865, Johnson restored voting and property rights to thousands of these men. In some cases, this process divested black families of land they had been given by the U.S. Army during the war. But before the war, Johnson was a bitter enemy of the plantation elite and championed the cause of white artisans and non-slaveholding farmers of East Tennessee. But in his efforts to keep pace with the shifting political alignments of the post-war era, he became a staunch defender of white supremacy and recast himself as the defender of embattled white elites. In the autumn of 1865, Southern states held new state elections. In the Upper South, a significant number of former Whigs and Unionists won, but voters in the Lower South largely re-elected Democratic Party elites who had led the region during the war. Most Northerners, and even some Democrats, reacted with shock and anger. But Johnson accepted the results as a product of the democratic process. Radical Republicans, however, grew increasingly uneasy with his leniency toward the South. Forced to accept emancipation, reconstituted state governments across the region adopted a series of laws known collectively as the Black Codes in the fall of 1865, which prescribed both the extent and limits of freedom for black residents in the region. Many black Southerners and many Northerners perceived the Black Codes as a blatant attempt to reimpose slavery throughout the region. The codes also focused not just on ex-slaves, but on all, quote, freed people, free Negroes, and mulattoes, end quote, effectively creating a new legal designation in Southern law that singled out black people where previously status, i.e. free or slave, had been the key distinction among residents. For Northerners, the second half of 1865 proved nearly as disorienting as the first half. Just as they had experienced the elation of victory and anguish over Lincoln's assassination, Northerners moved from supporting Johnson's initial measures to reconstruct the South quickly to anger at Johnson's capitulation to Southern arrogance. Carl Schurz, a prominent Civil War general and radical Republican, had been sent on a tour of the South by Johnson in late 1865 to assess the situation, but his findings undercut support for Johnson's policies. White Southerners, Schurz found, did not think of themselves as Americans and did not trust black Southerners to work in a new free labor economy. As Congress reconvened in December 1865, Its members heavily weighed the merits and methods of reconstructing the South. After much debate, Congress slowed down the process of Reconstruction by refusing to seat the delegations recently elected from Southern states. During the war, Union and Confederate forces alike had destroyed huge swaths of the Southern landscape, tearing down fence rails for firewood and tearing up railroads to weaken the Confederates' ability to fight. Most economically damaging of all was emancipation, which represented a capital loss of at least $3 billion for white Southerners. By one estimate, slave property comprised 60% of all wealth in the Deep South cotton states. Freed people thus entered the labor market during a period of severe contraction, with most farmers possessing little cash with which to pay workers. Because of the immediate necessity for freed people to sign a contract of some sort and begin earning money, they were in a poor position to negotiate with landowners. Agents of the Freedmen's Bureau served as the only check on exploitative labor agreements. Freedmen's Bureau agents settled labor disputes when they arose, but the Bureau never fielded more than 900 agents in the whole South, which rarely amounted to more than one per county. Despite the importance of their work, Johnson and congressional Democrats denounced the Freedmen's Bureau as an unwarranted extension of federal power. A typical political cartoon condemned the Bureau as, quote, an agency to keep the Negro in idleness at the expense of the white man, end quote. And while most Republicans remained committed to a limited government, and many were concerned about the constitutional issues raised by the Bureau, most regarded the work as too important to abandon. In 1866, Congress approved a one-year renewal of the Bureau. Johnson vetoed the bill, and, in a sign of growing Republican solidarity, Congress overrode his veto. Fresh from his defeat over the renewal of the Freedmen's Bureau, Johnson picked another fight with Congress, this time over the 1866 Civil Rights Act. The first instance of federal law designed expressly to protect the rights of citizens rather than prohibiting the actions of government. The bill was authored by moderate Republican Lyman Trumbull of Illinois and was intended as a middle ground between radicals who wanted strong intervention in southern states and conservatives who feared the centralizing nature of such action. The bill established a common national citizenship for all people born in the United States and promised the, quote, full and equal benefit of all laws and proceedings for the security of person and property, end quote. It also empowered federal courts to hear violations of rights, but the bill mainly protected people against state rather than private action. Johnson refused to accept even this moderate measure and vetoed the bill. His explanation, as with his earlier veto of the Freedmen's Bureau, conveyed his refusal to accept the centralization of power initiated by the bill. Johnson also made white supremacy an important part of his veto, arguing that by granting black Americans equal access to the law, it denied rights to whites. And, to Johnson's horror, the bill seemed to grant a, quote, perfect equality of the white and colored races, end quote. But Congress again overrode Johnson and enacted the legislation. Johnson's opposition to these two central measures and his intemperate veto messages ultimately isolated him politically and pushed the sizable body of moderate Republicans closer to the radicals. After the Civil Rights Bill passed, Republicans began debating a broader protection of individual rights. As they discussed what would become the 14th Amendment, Republicans again quarreled amongst themselves about the propriety of creating federal safeguards for individual rights. And again, moderates won the day, this time crafting a broad guarantee of national citizenship and equality before the law, but offering no specific protection of freed people's political rights. And even as the amendment expanded rights for some, it contracted rights for others. Article 1 of the Constitution refers only to, quote, people in sections on voting, but the 14th Amendment set the minimum requirements as, quote, male inhabitants, who are at least 21 years of age. Shortly after passage of the 14th Amendment, Republicans began working on the 15th Amendment. Ratified in 1870, the amendment issued a blanket prohibition against denying the right to vote on the basis of race. The amendment's failure to enfranchise women incensed women's suffrage advocates who had been working since the 1830s to win women the right to vote. Leading suffrage activists such as Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton had essentially paused their work on this project during the war to help further emancipation. But Congress's failure to consider women's suffrage created deep bitterness and led to tensions within the movement along racial lines. The 15th Amendment also completed a fundamental shift in the language of the Constitution and the American conceptions of freedom. The first 10 amendments to the Constitution all deny the ability of Congress to legislate on certain topics. They provide a, quote, negative liberty by protecting the people from government action. But the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments all concluded with the language of, quote, Congress shall have the power to enforce this provision, end quote. The post-war amendments relied on the idea of what's called positive liberty, which is grants on power to Congress for it to protect the freedom of certain aspects of Americans' lives. In this sense, the Civil War and Reconstruction represent a political revolution in the United States. Thaddeus Stevens, a Pennsylvania Republican, played a key role in the conflict with Johnson and the creation of federal protections for civil rights. Stevens helped lead the radical Republicans in Congress and served as perhaps the ablest and most dedicated white proponent of meaningful freedom for African Americans. In Congress, he used logic, rhetoric, and strong-arm parliamentary tactics to advance his agenda. Like other radicals, he regarded the Southern states as having actually left the Union. He therefore believed that Southern states could be subjected to specific terms before they were granted re-entry into the Union. For Stevens, the most important change, the one compelled by humanity and justice as well as political expediency, was to diminish the clout of the white elites in Southern life and elevate the freed people. Stevens believed that this could only be accomplished if the government broke up the great land holdings of the pre-war era and distributed the land to former slaves. But President Johnson killed a brief experiment with resettlement undertaken by General William T. Sherman in early 1865. Despite Stevens' urging, Republicans could not bring themselves to advocate the redistribution of property. For Stevens, the Southern reaction to the 14th Amendment proved the necessity of radically reordering Southern politics. After quick passage by Congress, the white Southerners overwhelmingly rejected the measure. The boldness of the Southern refusal to consider the 14th Amendment and the increasingly violent racial politics of the region, in which whites killed dozens of African Americans in Memphis and New Orleans during riots in the summer of 1866, pushed Congress to seize control of Reconstruction completely. In March 1867, Congress passed the first of a series of Reconstruction acts. Dramatic in their scope, the legislation consolidated the ex-Confederate states into 5 military districts, with former Union generals acting as military governors. To return to the Union, Congress required states to ratify the 14th Amendment and revise their constitutions to provide for black male voting. And in 1867, the House of Representatives impeached Johnson. The first U.S. president to ever be impeached, he remained in office because the Senate failed to convict him by 1 vote. However, politically, he was powerless. By the end of the year, Republicans turned with relief to selecting Johnson's successor, choosing the enormously popular Union General Ulysses S. Grant. Grant won the election easily in 1868, running on a platform of sectional reconciliation under the slogan, quote, "Let us have peace," end quote. Despite his optimism, little sectional peace prevailed during Grant's presidency. White Southerners resented the changes forced on them through the Reconstruction Acts, but with no voice in Congress besides a few ideologically sympathetic Northern Democrats, they had little choice but to submit. The first charge to the military governors now administering the Southern states was to hold elections to select delegates to state constitutional conventions. Black men participated in the election and helped produce a strong Republican victory, including the election of a majority of black delegates in South Carolina and Louisiana. In other southern states, black delegates comprised only a small percent of the delegates, but even that small number invalidated the entire process for most white Southerners. The victories in the South confirmed that the Republican Party would stay competitive in the region as long as they could maintain the support of African American voters.